Ruth Carter had been hiding in a broken barn for 2 days with her 3 children when the rain started falling harder. She pressed her back against the rotting wooden wall and pulled baby Emma closer to her chest. The 2-year-old's tiny body shook with cold, her lips turning blue despite the thin blanket wrapped around her. 6-year-old Layla sat in the corner, trying to keep 4-year-old Eli warm by rubbing his small hand between hers. But it wasn't working. Nothing was working anymore. The barn roof had more holes than solid wood. Every few minutes, another drop of icy water would fall through the gaps and land on one of the children. Layla would flinch each time, moving Eli away from the newest leak, only to have water start dripping somewhere else. The floor was mud now, cold and slippery. Ruth's shoes had holes in them, and her feet were numb. She had exactly 17 cents left in her pocket. 17 cents between her family and complete disaster. 3 months ago, Ruth had been a wife with a small but comfortable home. Her husband James worked hard at the lumber mill, and they had enough food on the table. The children had warm beds and clean clothes. Then the accident happened. A stack of lumber fell on James, crushing his chest. He died 2 days later, leaving Ruth with 3 children and nothing else. No savings, no insurance, no family who cared. James's brother had made it very clear what he thought of Ruth. "You were always too proud," he told her at the funeral. "James spoiled you. Now you'll learn what real life is like." When Ruth couldn't pay the rent on their little house, James's brother offered to take the children. "I'll raise them right," he said. "You can find work somewhere else." But Ruth knew what that meant. She would never see her babies again. So she took what little she could carry and ran. For 2 weeks, they had walked from town to town, looking for work, looking for help, looking for hope. Ruth knocked on doors, begged for jobs, offered to clean houses or wash dishes for just enough money to feed her children. But everywhere she went, the answer was the same. "We don't need help. Try somewhere else. Sorry, but we can't take the risk with 3 children." Some people were nice about it. Others just slammed the door in her face. The barn had seemed like a blessing when they found it. It was old and abandoned, but it had 4 walls and a roof. Ruth thought they could stay there for a few days while she figured out what to do next. That was before the rain started. Now water poured through the broken boards like tiny waterfalls. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, and her children were getting sicker by the hour. Layla had been running a fever since yesterday. Her cheeks were bright red, and she kept shivering no matter how many clothes Ruth piled on top of her. Eli couldn't stop coughing. Every few minutes, his small body would shake with another coughing fit that sounded like it was tearing him apart from the inside. And baby Emma barely cried anymore. She just lay against Ruth's chest, breathing in short, quick gasps that scared Ruth more than any screaming would have. Ruth looked around the barn desperately. Maybe there was something she had missed. Some corner that was drier, some way to block the wind. But she had already moved the children 3 times, trying to find the safest spot. There wasn't one. The whole barn was falling apart. She could see daylight through cracks in the walls. The floor was so rotted that her foot had gone through a board yesterday, and she had nearly fallen into the hole underneath. The worst part was the cold. It was only September, but the rain made everything feel like winter. Ruth's thin dress was soaked through. Her shoes squished with every step. She had given her coat to Layla, her sweater to Eli, and her shawl to Emma. Now she had nothing left to give. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to stop shaking. If she got sick too, what would happen to her children? She thought about James's brother again. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was being too proud. At least if she gave him the children, they would have warm beds and hot food. They would live in a real house with a solid roof. They would go to school and grow up healthy and strong. But they wouldn't be hers anymore. She would become just a memory to them, the mother who couldn't take care of them when they needed her most. Ruth looked down at Emma's pale face and made a promise. "I won't give up," she whispered. "I'll find a way. I'll keep you safe." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. What could she do with 17 cents? Where could they go when the barn became too dangerous to stay in? The rain was getting harder now. Ruth could hear it drumming on what was left of the roof like angry fingers tapping. A new leak started right above where Eli was lying. The water hit his forehead and ran down into his eyes. He whimpered and tried to turn away, but there was nowhere to go. Layla moved closer to her brother and used her sleeve to wipe the water from his face. "Mama," Layla said quietly, "I'm scared." Ruth's heart broke. Her 6-year-old daughter shouldn't have to be scared. She should be playing with dolls and learning to read and laughing with her friends. Instead, she was lying on a muddy floor in a broken barn, trying to take care of her little brother while their mother counted pennies and wished for miracles. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Ruth said, pulling Layla closer. "Mama's going to figure something out." But as she held her 3 children in that cold, wet barn, listening to the rain pour through the holes in the roof, Ruth Carter wondered if she was lying to them. And to herself. The storm was getting worse. The barn was falling apart around them. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear footsteps approaching through the rain. Someone was coming. Daniel McGrath had been watching the old barn from his kitchen window for the past hour. Something wasn't right about it. He'd noticed smoke coming from the chimney yesterday morning, which was strange because that barn had been abandoned for over 2 years. Then this morning, he saw it again. Just a thin wisp of gray smoke rising up through the rain, barely visible against the dark sky. Daniel was a practical man. At 35, he'd been running his ranch alone for 8 years, ever since his father died. He minded his own business, worked hard, and didn't ask questions about things that weren't his concern. But smoke from an abandoned building meant people. And people in that old barn during a storm like this meant trouble. He pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the dirt road between his house and the barn into a river of mud. Daniel had seen storms like this before. They could last for days, flooding creeks and washing out bridges. If someone was taking shelter in that falling down barn, they were in real danger. The barn sat at the far edge of what used to be the Peterson property. Old man Peterson had died 3 winters ago, and his family back east had never bothered to claim the land. The barn had been slowly rotting away ever since. Daniel had walked through it once last spring, checking to see if any of the lumber was worth salvaging. The roof was full of holes, the floor was soft with rot, and the whole structure leaned to one side like it was tired of standing up. As Daniel walked closer, he could hear something over the sound of the rain. Voices, quiet voices, like people trying not to be heard. His steps slowed as he approached the door. Maybe it was just drifters passing through, looking for a place to wait out the storm. He'd give them some food and directions to town, and they'd be on their way. Simple. But when Daniel reached the barn door, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A child coughing. Not just any cough, but the deep, harsh sound of someone very sick. He pressed his ear to the door and listened. There was again, and underneath it, a woman's voice, soft and desperate, trying to comfort someone. Daniel's hand hesitated on the door handle. Once he opened that door, whatever was inside became his responsibility. He thought about his quiet life, his peaceful routine, his freedom to come and go as he pleased. Then he heard the cough again, followed by a baby crying weakly, and his decision was made. The door creaked loudly as Daniel pushed it open. The sound echoed through the barn like a gunshot. Inside, he could see shapes huddled in the far corner, partially hidden by the shadows. A woman's voice called out, sharp with fear. "Please don't hurt us. We're not stealing anything. We'll leave right now." Daniel stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. What he saw made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. A young woman sat against the wall, holding a tiny child against her chest. 2 other children pressed close to her sides, all of them soaked and shivering. Their clothes were torn and dirty. Their faces were pale and thin, and they were looking at him like he was their worst nightmare come true. "Ma'am," Daniel said softly, removing his hat. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm Daniel McGrath. I own the ranch just over the hill." The woman stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 26. Pretty, despite the exhaustion and fear written across her face. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her shoulders, and her lips were blue with cold. "We're sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know this was your land. We were just looking for somewhere to stay until the rain stopped. We'll go now." "Ma'am, you can't go anywhere in this storm," Daniel said, looking around the barn. Water dripped steadily through dozens of holes in the roof. The floor was covered in puddles and mud. In one corner, he could see where part of the wall had started to collapse. "This whole place is about to fall down." The woman followed his gaze and seemed to shrink smaller against the wall. "We don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted. Daniel looked at the children more closely. The oldest was a girl, maybe 6 or 7, with fever-bright eyes and flushed cheeks. The boy beside her couldn't stop coughing, a sound that rattled in his small chest. And the baby in the woman's arms was too quiet, too still. These children weren't just cold and wet. They were sick, maybe dying. "How long have you been here?" Daniel asked. 2 days, the woman said. "We've been here 2 days. 2 days in this freezing, wet barn. 2 days of rain pouring through the roof. 2 days of watching her children get sicker and sicker with nowhere else to turn." Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, but not at this desperate mother. At whatever circumstances had brought her to this point. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Ruth," she said. "Ruth Carter. These are my children, Layla, Eli, and Emma." "Well, Mrs. Carter," Daniel said, crouching down so he was at eye level with the family. "You can't stay here another minute. This roof is going to cave in, and when it does, someone's going to get hurt." Ruth's face crumpled with despair. "I know," she whispered, "but we have nowhere else to go. No money, no family, nothing." Daniel looked at the 3 children, all of them shivering and sick, all of them depending on their mother to somehow save them. He thought about his warm house, his dry beds, his stocked pantry. He thought about his quiet, solitary life and how much it was about to change. "Come home with me," he said simply. "All of you, right now." Ruth stared at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "You heard me," Daniel said, standing up and extending his hand to her. "Come home." Ruth stared at the stranger's outstretched hand like it might disappear if she blinked. No one had offered to help them in weeks. No one had even looked at them with kindness. And now this man, this complete stranger, was telling them to come home with him? "I don't understand," Ruth whispered, clutching baby Emma tighter. "You don't even know us. We could be thieves or criminals or—" "Ma'am," Daniel interrupted gently, "I know enough. You're a mother trying to protect her children. That's all I need to know." He looked around the collapsing barn again, then back at the family huddled against the wall. "And I know that if you stay here much longer, these children are going to die." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow because she knew he was right. Layla's fever was getting worse by the hour. Eli could barely breathe between coughing fits. And Emma hadn't eaten anything solid in 2 days. Ruth had been telling herself they just needed to wait out the storm, but deep down, she knew they were running out of time. "Why would you help us?" Ruth asked, her voice breaking. "We have nothing to offer you. No money, no way to repay you." Daniel knelt down in front of little Eli, who was struggling to catch his breath after another coughing fit. The boy's lips had a blue tinge that Daniel recognized from when his own nephew had pneumonia 2 years ago. This child needed a doctor, and he needed one soon. "Son," Daniel said to Eli, "how would you like to get warm and dry? Maybe have some hot soup." Eli looked up at Daniel with wide, hopeful eyes, then at his mother for permission. Ruth felt her heart breaking all over again. Her children shouldn't have to ask permission to be warm and fed. They shouldn't have to live in fear and hunger and cold. "Mama," Layla said weakly, "I'm so cold." That was all it took. Ruth's pride, her fear, her distrust of strangers, none of it mattered anymore. Her children needed help, and this man was offering it. She took Daniel's hand and let him help her to her feet. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel scooped up little Emma, wrapping her in his heavy coat. The baby was so light, too light for a 2-year-old. Her skin was pale and cold, and when she looked at him with those big, dark eyes, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just about giving shelter to strangers anymore. This was about saving lives. "Can you walk?" Daniel asked Layla. The little girl nodded, but when she tried to stand, her legs wobbled. Daniel caught her easily, lifting her up in his other arm. "Eli, you hold on to your mama's hand, okay? We're going to walk to my house now." The journey from the barn to Daniel's ranch house was only a quarter mile, but it felt like forever. The rain soaked through their clothes immediately. Ruth's worn shoes slipped in the mud with every step. Eli stumbled and fell twice, his small body shaking with exhaustion. But Daniel never complained, never hurried them, never made them feel like they were a burden. When they finally reached the house, Daniel pushed open the front door and ushered them inside. Ruth had forgotten what warmth felt like. The house was clean and comfortable, with a stone fireplace crackling in the main room and oil lamps casting a golden glow on everything. It smelled like coffee and would smoke and something else, safety. "Sit here by the fire," Daniel said, settling Ruth and the children on a thick rug in front of the fireplace. He disappeared into another room and came back with an armful of blankets and towels. "Get out of those wet clothes. I'll find you something dry to wear." Ruth hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting help from strangers, especially men. But Emma was shivering so hard she could barely hold her, and Layla's teeth were chattering uncontrollably. Pride was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. While Ruth helped the children change into Daniel's oversized shirts and wool socks, Daniel busied himself in the kitchen. Soon, the smell of hot soup filled the house. Real soup, with vegetables and meat and thick, rich broth. Ruth's stomach cramped with hunger just thinking about it. "Here we go," Daniel said, carrying a tray with 4 steaming bowls. He set it down carefully and handed the first bowl to Layla. "It's chicken soup, my mother's recipe. She always said it could cure anything." Ruth watched in amazement as her children ate. Really ate for the first time in days. Layla's color started to come back as the warm soup filled her belly. Eli stopped coughing long enough to drink the whole bowl. Even little Emma managed a few spoonfuls before falling asleep in Ruth's arms. "There's more if you want it," Daniel said, but Ruth was already fighting back tears. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to see her children truly satisfied, truly cared for. For weeks, she had been measuring out tiny portions, making every scrap of food last as long as possible. Now, there was enough soup for everyone, and more if they wanted it. "I don't know how to thank you," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to thank me," Daniel replied. "You would do the same for someone else's children." After the children had eaten their fill, Daniel showed them to a small bedroom with 2 beds and clean sheets. Ruth tucked Layla and Eli into one bed, then settled into the other with Emma. For the first time in weeks, her children were warm and dry and safe. For the first time in weeks, Ruth allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard the sound of hoofbeats outside, slow and deliberate in the rain. Someone was riding toward the house in the middle of the storm. Ruth's blood ran cold as she remembered her brother-in-law's parting words. "I'll find you, Ruth. And when I do, those children are coming home with me." Ruth woke before dawn, her heart pounding. The sound of hoofbeats from the night before had haunted her dreams. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake baby Emma, who was sleeping peacefully beside her. Across the room, Layla and Eli were curled together under warm blankets, breathing easily for the first time in weeks. Layla's fever had finally broken during the night. Ruth slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The rain had stopped, and the first gray light of morning was creeping across the sky. Everything looked peaceful. Maybe she had imagined the rider. Maybe it was just her fears getting the better of her. But then she heard voices from the kitchen, Daniel's voice, and another voice she recognized with dread. Her brother-in-law, Marcus Carter, had found them. Ruth's hands shook as she quickly dressed and crept toward the kitchen door. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened to the conversation that would determine her family's fate. "I'm telling you, McGrath, she's not fit to raise those children," Marcus was saying. His voice had the same cold, judgmental tone Ruth remembered from James's funeral. "She's been dragging them around the countryside for weeks, living like animals. Did you see the state they were in when you found them?" "I saw a mother trying to protect her children," Daniel replied calmly. "And I saw 3 kids who were alive because she never gave up on them." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Protect them? She nearly killed them. That little one was burning up with fever, and the boy could barely breathe. If you hadn't found them when you did." Ruth closed her eyes, hating that Marcus was right. She had almost lost them. In her desperation to keep her children with her, she had put them in terrible danger. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the children would be better off with him and his wife. They had a big house in town, steady income, and no other children to worry about. "The point is, I did find them," Daniel said firmly. "And they're safe now." "Safe?" Marcus's voice rose. "You think it's safe for an unmarried woman to be living alone with a man she just met? What kind of example is that setting for those children? What are people going to say?" Ruth felt her cheeks burn with shame. She hadn't thought about what people would think. She had been so grateful for Daniel's help, so relieved that her children were warm and fed, that she hadn't considered how it would look to the outside world. An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. It was scandalous, especially in a small community like this one. "I don't much care what people say," Daniel replied. "Those children need their mother. Those children need stability." Marcus shot back. "They need a proper family, not some temporary arrangement that's bound to fall apart the minute you get tired of playing house." Ruth heard a chair scrape against the floor, and Daniel's voice became dangerously quiet. "I think you better leave now." "I'm not leaving without those children," Marcus said. "I have legal rights here. James was my brother, and his children belong with family, not with strangers." "Ruth is their family," Daniel said. "She's their mother. Ruth is a foolish girl who can't take care of herself, let alone 3 children," Marcus replied. "Look at what she's done to them. Look where I found them, hiding in a barn like animals, sick and starving. Is that the kind of mother you want to defend?" Each word hit Ruth like a physical blow. Because as much as she hated Marcus, as much as she resented his cold judgment, she couldn't deny that he was telling the truth. She had failed her children. She had let them get sick and hungry and scared. What kind of mother did that make her? The kitchen door opened suddenly, and Daniel stepped out, followed by Marcus. Ruth pressed herself against the wall, hoping they wouldn't see her, but it was too late. Marcus spotted her immediately. "Ruth," he said, his voice softening into false kindness. "There you are. I've been so worried about you and the children." Ruth lifted her chin, trying to find some dignity despite everything. "Hello, Marcus. I've come to take you home," Marcus continued. "All of you. Mary has prepared rooms for the children, and there's work for you in town. You don't have to live like this anymore." "We're not living like anything," Ruth said quietly. "Mr. McGrath saved our lives." Marcus looked between Ruth and Daniel with disapproval. "Yes, I'm sure he's been very helpful, but this arrangement can't continue. It's not proper. It's not fair to the children. They need stability, Ruth. They need a real home." "This is their home," Daniel said, stepping closer to Ruth. "For as long as they want it to be." Marcus turned on Daniel with anger flashing in his eyes. "You have no say in this matter. These children are not your responsibility. You don't know Ruth like I do. You don't know how selfish she can be, how she puts her own wants ahead of what's best for her family." "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice like steel. "Mrs. Carter is welcome here for as long as she chooses to stay. All of them are. And what happens when you get tired of them?" Marcus demanded. "What happens when a novelty wears off and you realize what a burden you've taken on? Where will they go then?" Ruth felt tears stinging her eyes because Marcus was voicing her own deepest fears. What would happen when Daniel realized what a mistake he'd made? What would happen when he got tired of having 4 extra people in his quiet house? What would happen when he found a wife of his own and didn't need Ruth and her children anymore? They'll still be welcome here, Daniel said firmly, because this is their home now. Marcus studied Daniel's face for a long moment, then turned to Ruth. I'll give you 3 days to come to your senses, he said. 3 days to think about what's best for your children instead of what's best for you. After that, I'll be back with the sheriff and legal papers. Those children belong with family, Ruth. Real family. With that, Marcus walked out the door, leaving Ruth and Daniel standing in the kitchen. Ruth wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop shaking. She felt like she was being pulled apart from the inside. He's right, she whispered, about me being selfish, about putting the children in danger. Daniel turned to face her, his eyes serious but kind. Mrs. Carter, there's something you need to understand. When I found you in that barn, I didn't just see a woman who had made mistakes. I saw a mother who would rather die than give up on her children. That's not selfish. That's love. The 3 days Marcus had given them passed like a dream Ruth was afraid to wake up from. Despite the looming threat of his return, life at the McGrath ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. Ruth threw herself into taking care of the house, determined to prove her worth and repay Daniel's kindness in whatever way she could. Every morning, Ruth woke before dawn to start breakfast. She would find Daniel already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise through the window. Without saying a word, she would pour herself a cup and sit across from him. They didn't talk much during these quiet moments, but Ruth began to treasure them. For 20 minutes each day, before the children woke up and work began, it was just the two of them sharing the peaceful silence of early morning. The children recovered quickly from their ordeal in the barn. Layla's fever disappeared completely, and her cheeks regained their healthy pink color. Eli's cough faded away, replaced by laughter as he discovered Daniel's collection of wooden toys and horse figurines. Little Emma started talking more, her vocabulary growing every day as she followed Ruth around the house, chattering about everything she saw. Daniel was gentle with all 3 children, but Ruth noticed he had a special soft spot for Emma. The 2-year-old would climb onto his lap after dinner, and he would tell her stories about the horses and cattle on the ranch. Emma would listen with wide eyes, occasionally patting his cheek with her small hand. Watching them together made Ruth's heart do strange things in her chest. Is Mr. Daniel our papa now? Emma asked one afternoon as Ruth was braiding her hair. Ruth's hands stilled in Emma's dark curls. No, sweetheart. Mr. Daniel is just helping us for a while. But I want him to be our papa, Emma said matter-of-factly. He's nice, and he makes good pancakes, and he doesn't yell like Uncle Marcus. Ruth didn't know how to respond to that. She had been trying so hard not to let herself think of Daniel as anything more than a temporary refuge. Getting attached would only make it hurt more when they had to leave, because eventually they would have to leave. Men like Daniel didn't just take in stray families and keep them forever. But as the days passed, Ruth found it harder and harder to maintain her emotional distance. Daniel fixed the loose floorboard in the children's room without being asked. He taught Eli how to whittle simple shapes from pieces of wood. He brought wildflowers from the meadow and put them in a jar on the kitchen table, just because Layla mentioned that she missed having pretty things to look at. Small gestures, but they added up to something bigger, something that felt dangerously like belonging. Ruth tried to focus on practical things. She organized Daniel's pantry, mended his clothes, and cooked meals that stretched their food budget as far as possible. She wanted to prove that she wasn't just a burden he had taken on out of charity. She had skills and could contribute to the household. Daniel seemed to notice her efforts. He started leaving her little notes of thanks, a scrap of paper on the kitchen table that said, "Thank you for fixing my shirt." Another one tucked into the flour jar that read, "Best biscuits I've ever had." Ruth saved every one of these notes, though she couldn't have explained why. One evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the children chase fireflies in the yard, Daniel surprised her with a question. "Do you ever think about getting married again?" he asked quietly. Ruth's heart stopped. Why would you ask that?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching Eli try to catch a particularly bright firefly. "Just wondering. You're young. You shouldn't have to face everything alone." "I have the children," Ruth said. "I'm not alone. You know what I mean?" Ruth didn't know what he meant, and the truth was that she had been thinking about it more and more lately. Not marriage in general, but marriage to him specifically. She thought about it when she woke up to find coffee already made and waiting for her. She thought about it when he carried Emma to bed after she fell asleep in his lap. She thought about it during their quiet morning conversations when she felt more at peace than she had since James died. But Ruth also knew that thinking about something and having it be possible were two very different things. She was a widow with 3 children and no money. Daniel was a successful rancher who could have his pick of eligible young women in town. Why would he saddle himself with someone else's family when he could start fresh with someone new? "Daniel," she said carefully, "what happens when Marcus comes back?" Daniel turned to look at her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to stay here," Ruth admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I want the children to grow up safe and happy. I want to wake up every morning without wondering where we'll sleep that night or where our next meal will come from. But I know that's not fair to you. This was supposed to be temporary, and I've already imposed on your kindness too much." "Ruth," Daniel said, and something in his tone made her look directly at him. "What if it didn't have to be temporary?" Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled something out. Even in the dim light, Ruth could see it was a small ring, simple gold with a tiny diamond that caught the light from the kitchen window. "It was my mother's," Daniel said, holding the ring carefully. "She gave it to me before she died and told me I'd know when I met the right woman to give it to." Ruth stared at the ring, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Daniel could hear it. "Daniel, I know this is sudden," Daniel said quickly. "I know we haven't known each other very long. But Ruth, I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. About all of you. When I see Emma run to me, when I come home from work, when I watch Eli learn something new, when I see Layla smile, this feels like the family I never knew I wanted." Tears started running down Ruth's cheeks before she could stop them. "You don't understand. I come with so much baggage. 3 children, no money, a brother-in-law who wants to take them away from me. I'm not the fresh start you deserve." "You're exactly what I deserve," Daniel said firmly. "Ruth, will you marry me? Will you let me be Emma's papa and Eli's and Layla's? Will you let me give you the life you should have had all along?" Before Ruth could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. A lantern bobbed in the darkness, getting closer. Marcus had returned, just as he'd promised, and he wasn't alone. Ruth's heart sank as she watched Marcus ride up to the house with 2 other men behind him. One of them wore a sheriff's badge that glinted in the lamplight. The other was dressed in a dark suit, probably a lawyer. Marcus had come prepared for a fight. Daniel stood up from the porch steps, the ring still in his hand. "Stay behind me," he said quietly to Ruth. Then, louder, he called out to the approaching riders. "That's far enough, Marcus." Marcus dismounted first, followed by the sheriff and the lawyer. Even in the dim light, Ruth could see the satisfaction on her brother-in-law's face. He thought he had won. "Evening, McGrath," Marcus said with false politeness. "I told you I'd be back. Sheriff Johnson, this is the man I was telling you about. He's been harboring my late brother's wife and children against the family's wishes." Sheriff Johnson was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Mr. McGrath, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about Mrs. Carter and the children." "Ask away," Daniel replied calmly. The lawyer stepped forward, pulling papers from his coat. "Mr. McGrath, I'm Thomas Whitmore. I represent the Carter family. We have legal documents showing that Mrs. Carter is unfit to care for these children and that they should be placed in the custody of their uncle, Marcus Carter. Ruth felt the world spinning around her. This was it. This was how she lost her children. Not to sickness or starvation, but to men with papers and legal words and the power to decide her family's fate. On what grounds? Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the tension Ruth could see in his shoulders. Abandonment of proper housing. Whitmore read from his papers. Endangerment of minor children. Failure to provide adequate medical care. And now, moral misconduct. Living unmarried with a man to whom she is not related. Each accusation hit Ruth like a physical blow. They were all true, in a way. She had put her children in danger. She had failed to provide for them properly. And she was living unmarried with Daniel, which would scandal any proper community. Mrs. Carter, Sheriff Johnson said gently, I need you to understand that these are serious charges. If you can't provide a good reason why these children should stay with you, I'm going to have to take them into custody tonight. Ruth opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? That she loved her children? That she had tried her best? That wouldn't be enough for men with legal papers and social expectations. But then Daniel stepped forward, and Ruth saw something in his posture that reminded her of a mountain, solid, unmovable, permanent. Sheriff, Daniel said clearly, there's something you need to know. Mrs. Carter is no longer living here unmarried. Marcus frowned. What are you talking about? Daniel reached for Ruth's hand and gently placed the ring on her finger. Ruth Carter just agreed to become my wife. We're engaged to be married. Ruth stared down at the ring on her finger in amazement. In all the chaos with Marcus arriving, she had never actually answered Daniel's proposal. But somehow, seeing that simple gold band on her hand, she knew her answer had always been yes. That's convenient timing, Marcus said suspiciously. You expect us to believe you just happened to propose tonight? I don't care what you believe, Daniel replied. I care about what's legal. And legally, Mrs. Carter is my fiancée. These children are going to be my stepchildren, and this is their home. Sheriff Johnson looked at the lawyer, who was shuffling through his papers with growing frustration. Is that right, Whitmore? Does an engagement change anything legally? The lawyer frowned. Well, it does complicate matters. If Mrs. Carter is engaged to a respectable landowner with stable income and proper housing, which I am, Daniel said firmly, then the charges of moral misconduct and inadequate housing would no longer apply, Whitmore admitted reluctantly. Marcus's face was turning red with anger. This is ridiculous. They barely know each other. This is just a scheme to avoid losing the children. Can you prove that? Daniel asked calmly. Can you prove that I don't love Ruth and her children? Can you prove that we haven't been planning this for weeks? Of course, Marcus couldn't prove any of that because it wasn't true. But Ruth realized that it didn't matter whether it was true or not. What mattered was that Daniel was willing to marry her to keep her family together. He was willing to tie his life to hers, to take on the responsibility of 3 children, to face down the judgment of his community, all to protect them. When's the wedding? Sheriff Johnson asked. Ruth looked at Daniel, panic fluttering in her chest. They hadn't discussed any details. They hadn't even had time to talk about whether this was what they really wanted or just what they needed to do to save her children. Sunday, Daniel said without hesitation. This Sunday, Pastor Williams can perform the ceremony after regular church service. 3 days from now, Sheriff Johnson mused. That's awfully quick. When you know, Daniel said, looking directly at Ruth. And in his eyes, Ruth saw something that made her heart stop. This wasn't just a legal maneuver to him. This wasn't just about saving her children from Marcus. Daniel meant it. He really wanted to marry her. Marcus made one last desperate attempt. Sheriff, you can't let them get away with this charade. Those children belong with blood family. Mr. Carter, Sheriff Johnson said tiredly, those children belong with their mother. And if their mother is marrying a good man who can provide for them, Then that's where they're going to stay. He tipped his hat to Ruth. Congratulations, ma'am. I hope you'll be very happy. After the men rode away, Ruth and Daniel stood on the porch in silence, both of them still processing what had just happened. The ring on Ruth's finger felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Did we just get engaged? Ruth asked quietly. I believe we did, Daniel replied. Are we really getting married on Sunday? If you want to, Daniel said. Ruth, I meant what I said earlier. This isn't just about Marcus and the legal problems. I want to marry you. I want to be Emma's papa and Eli's papa and Layla's papa. I want us to be a real family. Ruth looked through the kitchen window at her 3 children, who had fallen asleep on blankets by the fire while the adults talked outside. They looked peaceful and safe and loved. They looked like they belonged. Yes, Ruth said, turning back to Daniel. Yes, I want that too. Sunday came faster than Ruth had expected. She wore a simple blue dress that Daniel had bought for her in town, and the children wore their best clothes. The ceremony was held under the big oak tree in Daniel's front yard, with Pastor Williams reading from his worn Bible and the whole community watching. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Ruth gently, and Emma clapped her hands in delight. Now you're really our papa, she announced, making everyone laugh. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ruth and Daniel sat on their porch now, watching the stars come out. Do you remember what you said to me the first day in the barn? Ruth asked. Come home with me, Daniel replied. Ruth smiled, leaning against his shoulder. I thought you just meant for dinner. I didn't know you meant forever. I did mean forever, Daniel said, wrapping his arm around her. From the moment I saw you protecting those children, I knew you belonged here. I knew you belonged with me. Ruth looked out at the ranch that was now her home. Really her home, with her name on the deed and her children running free in the yard and her husband beside her on the porch. A year ago, she had been hiding in a broken barn with 17 cents and no hope. Now she had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For saying come home and meaning it, Ruth said. For giving me the one thing I never thought I'd have again. What's that? Ruth smiled in the darkness. A place where I belong.